Although the film adaptation of the original Jurassic Park novel by Michael Crichton was basically the same overall story, albeit somewhat streamlined, some people seem unaware of the differences between both properties, and specifically the different ways in which their characters are handled. Now that we are approaching the 5th film in the movie franchise due out next year, and have confirmation of Jurassic Park's creators passing from the last film, I thought it would be important to go over the demise of the eccentric billionaire as first told in Crichton's book. The Death of John Hammond is a meaningful one that takes place towards the very end of the story, and its events have actually been seen before in a past Jurassic film with another character. Before we go over its events, I want to stress that novel Hammond is very different to movie Hammond, and point out that the owner of InGen is depicted as being more of what's called the dark side of Walt Disney than necessarily the jolly old Scottish grandfather as seen in the 1993 film by Steven Spielberg. The events leading up to this moment in the story contain the breakout of the Tyrannosaurus and the subsequent injuries sustained by Ian Malcolm during its attack, as well as Muldoon leaving to do battle with the raptors, and both Dr. Wu and Mr. Arnold having just recently been killed by the same dinosaurs. Lex and Tim have been brought back to the visitor center and begin to play with the electronic controls that synthesize dinosaur roars for the future tourists, while Grant, Ellie, and Gennaro begin their mission to destroy the velociraptor nests. Dr. Jerry Harding is presently treating Malcolm and administering antibiotics to the dying chaotician, who keeps mumbling something that none of them can understand, and Hammond is beginning to pace the room the 3 men are occupying. Hammond feels deep anxiety while waiting for the helicopter to pick them up in the last few moments. Even though he hates Ian, he doesn't want the man to die, and he fears that his death could be the final nail in the coffin for representing Jurassic Park as a dangerous venture and one not so suitable for the many tourists he's had planned. Malcolm utters something the other 2 men can't make out. Everything para. Hammond quickly maneuvers himself next to the doctor, asking him what Ian's just said. Was it something about paradise? But Harding didn't catch it, and just continues to administer the antibiotics the chaotician needs. He's becoming terminally delirious, and his medicine supply is beginning to run dry. Hammond can't stay here any longer, and asks his veterinarian if it's safe to go outside. Jerry says it should be fine, and John takes his leave of the room and goes out to get some fresh air. The park owner strolls around the gates of the fence and begins to think on his experiences here on Nublar. This was such a mess, and he feared being shut down, and his park closed indefinitely before it had even been opened to the public. Gennaro would make sure of that. A thought began to present itself to the man as he wandered about his island. Wu hadn't been up to the job. He was constantly talking about improving the animals, making them different or special. His head was in the wrong place. Here they had real dinosaurs, and Wu wanted to make them slow and stupid like the storybooks all these people would have read and envisioned in their childhoods. Hammond had the real thing. He also thought on Arnold and how fretfully worrisome he had become. He was a man at the top of his field, but in reality, he was a has-been. He was too old for this thing. And Muldoon was a drunk. Gennaro would almost certainly shut him down. But it didn't matter. There were plenty of embryos stowed away in a vault within InGen headquarters off of the island, and if this place did have any problems, then he just fixed them. That's how all progress is made. Next time, it'll be flawless. Hammond passed one of his Tecan workers now along a stroll. The man nodded to the billionaire, but Hammond paid him no mind. He hated having chosen a place around Costa Rica. This place. The Tyrannosaur? What could the Tyrannosaur possibly be doing here? Hammond turned around and saw the Tecan worker running for his life and thought for a split second he saw the shadow of the juvenile Rex running towards him. Hammond ran. He ran and turned off the path, tripping himself up from the difference in ground. He fell, and rolled, and didn't stop rolling until he reached the bottom of the hill. His face was in a small stream, and his ankle was almost certainly broken. He heard the roar of the Tyrannosaur again. God, it scared him. Then he heard the familiar sound of his grandchildren, emanating over the loudspeakers of the park. They were complaining about getting turns and pressing buttons, and then suddenly Hammond heard the Rex cry again, only this time in a strange musical tone along with a persisting echo heard afterwards. Hammond thought for a second that bringing his damned grandchildren was a serious problem he'd made. He picked himself up, and after realizing he couldn't make it up the hill on his broken ankle, he begins to shout for help. Now Malcolm began to speak more clearly to Harding. He stated that everything looked different on the other side. Harding thought the man was about to pass and asked him what other side he could be speaking of, with Malcolm's reply being one of paradigm. This leads Harding to remember the mathematician's earlier words that they couldn't make out, and he asks Ian if he's speaking of paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts were not an often occurrence and usually shook the scientific community and the very world to the core with a deeper understanding of intricacies. Darwinian evolution and quantum mechanics were good examples. Malcolm says it's not just paradigm, but beyond paradigm, and states he doesn't care anymore. Jerry Harding asks what he doesn't care about, and gets Ian's response of anything. He doesn't care about anything anymore, because everything looks so different, on the other side. Malcolm smiles, and that's the last we see of him before Muldoon tells us he's passed. Hammond had been attempting an ascent of the hillside for over an hour. His ankle was purple and swollen now. He began to experience dizziness while climbing. He could practically see his bungalow over the hill, but he had made very little progress climbing out of here. He was 76 years old, and even though he took extremely good care of himself, shouldn't have to climb a hill with a broken ankle at his age. Suddenly, little bits of earth began to tumble down towards John. He looked up to see a small green chicken-sized creation squeaking and hopping his way. And then another. And then another. Compys, Hammond thought. They weren't necessarily dangerous, but they did have a slightly poisonous bite. They used this venom to subdue larger crippled animals. Suddenly, Hammond felt the very real sensation of dread fill his body. The Compy venom was like a narcotic. It made you feel dreamy and have no sense of pain. John thought the hell with that as he threw a stone square in the chest of one of the Compys and knocked it back away, screaming in pain. The others backed off, and Hammond turned around and tried to maneuver his way out of this mess. Then John felt the weight of one of his animals pouncing on his back. He lost his balance and began to tumble down the hill again. A Compy jumped on his chest now and took a bite out of his hand. Hammond looked at the blood run down his palm in horror as he turned around to ascend the hillside. The Compys began to swarm him now, taking small bites and chirping around him excitedly. He began to cease batting them away. He started to feel detached from himself, and very relaxed. He turned around facing the animals while lying on his back. They were like a group of excited birds, chirping away. One jumped up on Hammond and nipped him on the cheek, but he didn't care anymore, and he laid there as the animals descended upon him from the hillside, being at total peace with himself. Here comes all his little creations. John Hammond's death in the film canon is as different to its novel version as the characters are to one another, and while this scene wasn't used in the original Jurassic Park film, it would be retooled and repurposed for Dieter Stark in The Lost World just a few years later. One of the things that Hammond's actor, the late Richard Attenborough, brought up to Spielberg was the difference in the novel's ending for his character opposed to the film's.
And I said, one of the sad things I said is I've been robbed of my great death scene. He said, well, you may have been robbed of a death scene. You may not have been robbed of a sequel.
The death of John Hammond would ultimately become alluded to in The Lost World, as Hammond's condition would continue to deteriorate from Ludlow's acquisition of his company, and the revival of Jurassic Park through his raid on Isla Sorna, but his character isn't seen passing on screen, and unfortunately Attenborough himself passed away in 2014, just before the release of Jurassic World. The differences in both characters is quite stark, and many believe that the more bitter and resentful version of John Hammond may be resurrected in the new character Benjamin Lockwood, who will be appearing as an old business partner of the billionaire in next year's Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Whatever the case may be, Attenborough's interpretation of the character is still my favorite. I just couldn't see Hammond in any other way after his work on the first two Jurassic Park films, and while I do love the novel, I'm glad they saved this death and repurposed it for The Lost World. Jurassic Park just wouldn't be the same without this actor's incredible performance as John Hammond. Now, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching this video. If you like what you've seen, I would appreciate the like and hope you consider subscribing so that you can see me again. I'll see you all in the next video, and as always guys, take it easy.